Let's take a look at a situation for melee combat. Basically, what happens is the enemy comes within, arm's length, and there's a fight. Um, Now, you could decide not to do anything, and the enemy will do its attack on you, and eventually it'll just keep attacking. Let's assume that it doesn't want to shoot anymore, and because it is within hand to hand combat range, it switches to a melee hand to hand combat style of attacking. And as a result, um, you'll eventually succumb to your injuries. So, you'd stand there like this and not do anything and just stand there with your, still and, nothing's happening to the enemy. That's one possibility. Okay. A more likely scenario is obviously we've done a melee animation for our hero character. And the idea is that, when things are within range, you're going to be trying to fight, and it's going to be trying to fight. And you have this sort of, back and forth kind of exchange, right? So the enemy is here, and you decide to switch to a melee attack to make contact, take some swipes, and meanwhile, the enemy is doing that too. So, because at the same token, you won't expect that an enemy that's been chasing you, shooting at you, and coming towards you to try to get as close to you as possible to harm you or eliminate you or neutralize you, whatever the term you want to use, suppress you, cause harm to you, act on you, cause violence. It's not just going to suddenly like stand there and do nothing. So it makes sense to have a melee animation for the enemy that represents some sort of action, okay, or some sort of melee action like this. And I'll try to. I've done that here. That claw hand is sort of meant to be striking or attacking, right, to cause some sort of a damage. Now, the movement is a bit, you know, the idea too is he's kind of flinching a bit too, as if being hit by you. Okay. But the problem is if you just stand there, you can either do two animations, I guess, if you decide to just stand there and the enemy won't flinch at all. But, who wants to do so many animations? It starts to get so complicated with your mechanism and your machine states and transition to this animation. So a little bit of an indication from the enemy that it's getting hit, but nothing. But, on the other hand, if my gun hand wasn't moving, let's imagine just sort of if I move it back. If I move the enemy back a bit, you can imagine you can't see, or that the gun hand is just not, standing still. You want an animation that, you know, well, maybe he's adjusting something or positioning for the hit. You want something that can kind of be maybe both ways, interpreted like a readying kind of, a setting up kind of, winding up to kind of wind up to do something, or at the same time, well, it's reacting because it's putting that shoulder back because it got hit and it's kind of, recoiling, kind of thing. So, um, it's a fine line. I mean, it depends how in depth you want to go with your animations. For the purpose here, I'll just try this to kind of get away with kind of, in case you stand there and don't do anything, he's going to still just do his claw thing and cause you harm. But hey, if you're fighting him, he's going to, he's also reacting a bit. It's doing something, or it's throwing him off a little bit. Now, done another animation. If you keep bashing away, I've done set up a second animation to basically have the enemy moving back. Okay. And that's not shown here. It's a second animation. And you see this a lot in games. A good example again, example I've used a few times is Fallout 76. And now he's too far. I backed him up because, let's get him in close again, like the way it would be actually in the game. That's obviously too close. Clipping. So it would look something like this. You'd be back at your first frame. It'll pretend that these hitboxes are, you're making hits there. It's hitting you kind of thing. It's hit your hand or done some damage or it's got a radioactive. You can actually see they're clipping each other. I mean, they're kind of, the scale's a bit off. No, the problem is, the problem is on the armature, I have the bones set to front. So it's always going to put the bones to the front of the, yeah. So it looks funny, but. And now we're not doing this all in Blender. This is all just an illustration of how it's sort of what concepts you have to kind of keep in mind. Okay? So, yeah, like, you're hitting, he's hitting, Meanwhile, if you weren't hitting and he was just doing that to you over and over again kind of thing, it's like he's just kind of doing some sort of setup and winding up. It can kind of be interpreted both ways. Okay. Now, yeah, it looks a little bit like the robot's too big or whatever. The scale might be a bit off, but you can always fix that in your Unity. Now, so that's the idea, okay? And like I said, I've done another project where I've actually set these animations up, and I'll go through that, okay, just for demonstration. So, if we look at the one where it's this one I want. So this is the first one, and it's like what we're seeing. I'll turn the bones off. Just looks a little better. And, he comes in and he does this little chop, and, that's what he does. He's doing this, and it's like, well, yeah, maybe you're hitting him and he's reacting, or maybe he's just winding up. If you're not hitting him, he's winding up. If you're hitting him, he's reacting. You know what I mean? That's the kind of thing you want with the animation. Maybe, unless you want to go an extra level and do another animation for, difference between if you're not doing anything versus doing, retaliation, right? It's just you don't want an element in the game that looks like such an obvious flaw, like, oh, I'm not even hitting him and he's flying across the room kind of thing. You have to decide how you're going to handle it for your logistics in terms of how much work you're willing to do for your game. Trying to kill two birds with one stone by just having one animation where it's kind of moving, reacting, and kind of hitting, bit of a cheat. The other animation is what happens if you keep bashing away. Let's go back to the previous one. And, you're bashing away at this guy and you're fighting it out. You just don't, I mean, you can imagine you're doing this and you hit the mouse, right click, and you're bashing and it's just the same thing. Well, it's kind of boring. Okay. So maybe what we can do in Unity is we'll set up a rule that, like, once it gets hit a couple times, the enemy, it does something else. And that something else can be stepping back and stepping forward. So that's what this animation is doing. And I don't even have a camera in there, so I can't even, I'll turn it off, but so he gets kind of more dramatically affected and he's not hitting. It's like he's kind of really got to take a step back, but then he comes back in and he wants to get back into the fight. And you can imagine that it would now go back to that first melee animation of, with that arm clawing, swinging out, and that sort of left shoulder twist again, kind of like again, like here. So this is sort of like a secondary staggering kind of reaction by the enemy that's a little bit more serious, okay, or a little bit more like you're having an effect here, okay? And yeah, maybe you can imagine that if you kept mashing the button, it could be, you know, looping in this. I mean, it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. You keep attacking, and he can't really even get a hit in anymore. He's too, the enemy is too overcome that he's just trying to get it back on its feet kind of thing, and can't even set up to attack you anymore. And, that could kind of, maybe during this part then, because the enemy is not really doing you any harm, it's more on the defensive, during this stage, there's no harm coming to the hero player, because you're on the attack, causing this sort of loop where it's only trying to get back into the fight and can't even throw a punch or throw a hit, or make an attack. So it just adds an extra element, okay, a sort of secondary, element, an extra animation, okay. So this one I would call like retreat or stutter or fall back or retreat or something, and the first one I would call just melee, okay. And I'll do a more in-depth video in a moment, looking at those elements, and then we'll bring them into Unity and we'll actually do the scripting.